Hi, this is part 3 of a series that I'm calling The Journey. And by the journey, I mean life. God is interested in the journey, not just the destination. And the purpose of the journey is to learn to love God, love God's creation, love other people, and to love ourselves. For me, the hardest part of that process is learning to love myself, and I still have a long way to go. And I'd like to share with you just a little bit of my life, my journey. Not because I think it's extraordinary, but simply because I believe that it may encourage some of you, and hopefully it will let some of you know that you're not alone. So, and of course, all of our journeys are individual, all of our stories are different. The glorious variety of life. So, I was born the second of two children, to parents who were both relatively highly educated and very involved in science. My father, at the time that I was born, was a postdoctoral fellow in biochemistry at the University of Illinois. And so I was born in Urbana, Illinois. I have a sister who is 4.5, 5 years my senior. She was born when my father was in graduate school getting his PhD in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin. So she was born in Madison. So two siblings, separated by a relatively large gap. My dad, as I said, well, let me back up. Let me back up a generation. My dad was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. He was the oldest of two. He had a younger sister. His father died of kidney failure due to high blood pressure when my dad was 12 years old. He was immediately expected from that moment on to be the, quote, man of the house, end quote. And financially, he cared for his mother for the rest of her life. She was only in her 30s when her husband died. My grandfather, my father's father, was only 36 or 37, something like that, when he died. And my grandmother never remarried, never got a driver's license, never had a job outside of the home. She was cared for financially by my father from the age 12 on. Now, my father's paternal grandfather stepped in and was a father figure, but did not live with the family. And I know my dad liked him a lot, but I don't know much about the influence that he had on him. My dad was a intellectual guy. He worked hard at school. He got good grades. He got into Washington College, which is located, it's a very old private liberal arts school that's located in Chestertown, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland. He went to college there, had some scholarships, also worked various part-time jobs, everything from from the time he was 12 on, he worked part-time jobs. He was an elevator operator in downtown Baltimore at one point, and got really tired of people saying, "I bet this job has its ups and downs, doesn't it? Yuck, yuck, yuck." At one point, he worked cleaning out railroad chemical tanker cars by hand. Had to get down in there and scrub it, and I'm amazed he lived as long as he did. The fumes and toxic stuff he must have been exposed to while, that was going on. And he also, he never learned to read music, but he played guitar. And he played guitar as part of a big band. And that provided some income when he was in high school and college as well. He entered college in 1940. He graduated with a degree in chemistry 4 years later, and went to graduate school at Georgia Tech. He was, I don't think he was there a full year. I'm not sure I have the timing exactly right, but at any rate, it was somewhere between 6 months and a year. Graduate school there. He was a very astute student of history and politics, and also of the natural world. He loved the natural world. So he recognized that the war in Europe was going to, before too long, include the United States. It was already raging, of course, in Europe. So he dropped out of graduate school and joined the Navy. Because he already had a college degree, he was put into officer training school at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and then was commissioned as a naval officer. And he served in the Navy throughout all of World War II. He wasn't at sea for 4 years straight, but he was at sea for most of that time. Brought back stateside for trainings, and then shipped out. He was on 3 different ships. During World War II, he was on a minesweeper that was the first ship in the Mediterranean Sea. The record shows that they took fire someplace off the coast of Africa and lost several men. He was given more training, and then he was a gunnery officer, promoted and became a gunnery officer on a destroyer, the old tin cans. They were called that because the skin of the ship was so thin. And compared to battleships, they were much, much smaller. And they spent quite a bit of time hunting German submarines all over the Atlantic Ocean. The Germans called their submarines U-boats, underwater boats. And then after Germany surrendered, he was transferred to another destroyer in the Pacific Fleet, and they helped with the liberation of the various South Pacific islands, and the destroyers were used to escort convoys of ships and that sort of thing. So he was at sea pretty much all of World War II, served in all 3 Marine theaters, again as an officer in the Navy. After the war, he was discharged from the Navy and resumed his education. His education meant that he got back into graduate school, and as I said, University of Wisconsin, By this time, he and my mother, of course, were married. They met in college, and he uh, got his PhD in biochemistry. Then he did a postdoctoral thing. That's when I was born, and at Urbana. And then he took a job in the School of Hygiene at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I'm not sure how long he was in that position, but after a few years, a colleague, friend of his, was asked to start a brand new department in the university, which would be located in the Homewood campus, which is where the undergraduate school is. It's more in suburban Baltimore. And the new department would be a department of oceanography. And so they recruited professors for each area of oceanography. And to make a long story short, my dad was the biological oceanographer. There was also a mathematical oceanographer and a physical oceanographer and so forth. Excuse me. Pardon me. Dry throat. And so I was moved with my family when I was 10 months old from Illinois to Baltimore. And we lived in a lower middle class row home. Most of the people around us were working class people. My dad was an oceanographer and was very fascinated with the natural world, as I said. He loved to be out in nature. He loved to bird watch. He got involved with the Maryland Ornithological Society. At one point, he did a stint as president of the Maryland Ornithological Society. And we did a lot of early morning bird walks and weekend bird camping trips. And those, I remember those times with a lot of joy and a lot of happiness. Those were beautiful times. Before I move on from my father to my mother, let me tell you just a little bit about his personality. He was extremely quiet, introverted. He had very few friends. He was completely cut off emotionally from his mother. He seemed irritated with his mother her whole life, during the time that I knew them both. He was frequently struggling with inner demons that none of us really recognized or saw. We saw it, but we didn't know what the cause was. Looking back, I think some of it was that he was never allowed probably to really grieve the death of his father completely, that he was expected to be the man of the house, as I mentioned, and he resented that, I think, his whole life. He did take care of his mother physically, but he didn't like her. She lived with us from the time I was an infant, moved back to Baltimore. She moved in with us. My dad built a little apartment for her down in the basement of this 3-story thin row home that was attached to neighbor home. You could hear the people talking in the next door, right through the wall. But her life was, my grandmother's life was really pretty separate from the family. She was occasionally, but rarely, invited upstairs to have dinner with us. Normally, she lived her own life, came and went, riding the bus, walking to the grocery store. I think she's probably spent most of her life just kind of sitting in the dark watching television. He did not seem to like having her around at all. As I said, he was very very closed. Um, I loved him, and yet I struggled with trying to get him to love me. He would play catch with me, but before I was old enough to be in a little league, he was a little league coach for other kids, but never for me. Never taught me how to hit a baseball. Never taught me the fundamentals of fielding a baseball. He taught my sister, older sister, a lot of things like how to replace an outlet in the house, for instance, but he never taught me. He did teach me some things. He taught me how to solder circuits. He bought me a Heath kit, and I made a shortwave radio pretty much by myself, although he set me up and showed me the basics, and I'm sure he glanced over my shoulder, and it worked. It worked for years. He also seemed to enjoy it when I would stand next to him. He was quite a craftsman when it came to making things out of wood. He made a lot of cabinets and such. And as a little boy, I would watch. I loved the smell of sawdust, and he would let me help a little bit. Taught me some safety rules around saws and that sort of thing. Encouraged me to take shop when I got to junior high school. And as I said, these bird trips that we went on, they were beautiful, but even there was hardly any interaction with either of my parents. It was a group of adults, mostly adults. In fact, I remember my sister and I being the only children. We may not have been, but that's the way I remember it. And some of those adults were really kind and gracious and took me under their wing and taught me a bunch of fun stuff. But my mom and dad were just in the group, you know. They were not really interacting with me. At times, my father would become very irritated, and on occasion, he would burst into my bedroom after I had gone to bed and berate me with a long lecture about all the various things that I, in his opinion, was doing or had done wrong. I don't remember what any of that was about. I do remember that at the time it was happening, I didn't know what it was about. I remember as a boy, little boy, lying there listening to this barrage thinking, what on earth is he talking about? I mean, I do remember him saying something about, you did a poor job mowing the lawn. And I remember thinking, I did the best I could. I mowed the lawn the same way I always mow the lawn, you know. And then, you know, after the lecture, there wasn't any discussion. It wasn't a dialogue. No one ever asked me how I was feeling or any of that. After the lecture, out he would go, and that would be the end of it. So you never knew when one of those was going to happen. He seemed quietly depressed and angry most of his life, but keeping it inward. It seemed to me that he was, he found it almost impossible to express emotions of any kind. When my mother got a phone call telling her that her mother had died suddenly and unexpectedly and burst into tears, my mother burst into tears relating that to us, I remember my father just sitting there staring, unable to express any emotion whatsoever. I remember a later time when my mother was really freaked out about something, and I must have been in high school. I calmed her down with something I said, and my father afterwards thanked me for that and said, he said, I never know what to say, talking about himself. He died at the age of 71 or 72 in 1990, I believe. January of 1990, I think. Um, and he is buried in Chestertown, Maryland, the same little town where he went to college and where he met my mother. And I'll pick it up in the next one, talking some about my mother.